Journal contains a special report on what it calls the coming global epidemic, a pandemic.
Each year, different flus come, but your immune system says, ah, I've seen that guy before, no problem, crank out some antibodies. Might not feel great for a couple of days, but I'll recover. Now, what's scaring us is that this constellation of H number 5 and N number 1, to our knowledge, has never in history been in our species. So absolutely nobody watching this has any natural immunity to this form of flu.
This form of the flu started, as do almost all flu viruses, in wild birds in Asia.
They die of a pneumonia, just like people. When you open them up, you do a postmortem exam, their lungs are just full of fluid and full of blood.
Bill Karish, the lead veterinarian for the Wildlife Conservation Society, has been tracking this rare flu strain since it first emerged in the 1990s and has watched as it's gained strength, going from wild birds to chickens to humans.
The last outbreak in July that was reported was this part of China. It started in a market somewhere in Guangdong province, and it's just packed with cages. You have chickens, you have ducks, cats, dogs, turtles, snakes, and they're all stacked in cages and they're all spreading their germs to each other.
Asian governments have killed millions of chickens in a futile attempt to stop the flu's spread to humans. Dr. Erwin Redliner heads Columbia University's National Center for Disaster Preparedness.
The tipping point, the place where it becomes something of immediate concern, is when that virus mutates to something that is able to go from human to human.
So now scientists in Asia and around the world, on a literally hour-to-hour basis, are watching for that tipping point to occur.
This virus is a pretty nasty piece of work.
Dr. Malik Paris is the scientist who first identified the so-called SARS virus 2 years ago, which killed more than 700 people and triggered a worldwide scare. This, he says, is much worse.
Unlike the normal human flu, where the virus is predominantly in the upper respiratory tract, so you get a runny nose, sore throat, the H5N1 virus seems to go directly deep into the lungs. So it goes down into the lung tissue, causes a severe pneumonia.
To date, there have been 57 confirmed human deaths and another suspected one just last week in Indonesia. Scientists say the humans who have been infected so far have been infected by birds, but that every infected person represents one step closer to the tipping point.
Once that virus is capable of not needing the bird to infect humans, so in other words, if you have it, I can get it from being in contact with you, then we have the beginnings of what can turn out to be this worldwide epidemic problem that the experts call pandemics.
That's what happened in 1918, a shocking reminder of the worst case scenario. It was known as the Spanish flu.
It was the most horrible time. By the hundreds they were dying, and no doctor could stop the epidemic.
We had little caskets for the little babies that stretched for 4 and 5 blocks.
The Spanish flu was killing people in 2 or 3 days once they got sick. It started at the end of World War I. It actually came to America with returning soldiers from Europe and then spread through the United States.
In 1918, my now quite elderly uncle was a young boy, and the flu came through, and his family insisted that he could not go outside for any reason until the whole epidemic was over. He spent his afternoons looking out the window and counting the hearses going up and down the neighborhood and trying to guess which of his schoolmates had died and keeping a little scorecard.
That was before the international air travel routes of today, with nonstop flights from flu ground zero to the United States.
So it's going to come out of Bangkok or Hanoi or Hong Kong or Shanghai, get into Japan, it'll get to New York, it'll get to San Francisco, it'll get to Vancouver, it'll get to Paris and London, all within a matter of the first week.
It's on people's hands. You shake hands. You touch a doorknob that somebody recently touched.
And that's how this particular strain, never seen before, could spread.
Absolutely. There's no reason to believe that if H5N1 manages to make that crucial punch through genetically, it won't spread like every other flu.
And once it hits a city like New York,
It's extremely possible. We'd have to quarantine hospitals, we'd have to quarantine sections of the city.
Dr. Redliner has been working with New York City officials to get ready for the deadly epidemic.
The city would look like a science fiction movie. This would look like an armed camp, basically.
You would ring a neighborhood in New York City with armed officers to keep people from leaving or going in.
Yes.
Actually shut down parts of New York City.
We might have to do that. Correct.
I could imagine that you would look at Grand Central Station and not see much of anybody wandering around at all. People would be afraid to take the subways because who wants to be in an enclosed airspace with a whole lot of other strangers, never knowing which ones are carrying flu?
We might be seeing 200 to 350 people every single day dying from the flu in New York City.
Every single day?
Every single day. And a quarter to a third of those might be children.
And for hospitals, there would be scenes like the ones this month in Houston and New Orleans, except the cots would be full of dying people.
There wouldn't be equipment and personnel to staff them adequately that you could really call them a hospital. You might more or less call them warehouses for the ailing.
And as happened in New Orleans, there would be no place for the dead.
If you look at the expected number of deaths that could occur in cities across the United States, we are wholly unprepared to process those bodies in a dignified and respectful way. We will run out of caskets literally within days.
University of Minnesota professor Michael Osterholm is the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research.
That's the kind of realities that we have to start planning for now that unfortunately in most communities in this country we just haven't even begun to think about.
The prospects have been so bleak that in planning sessions held in New York City, some veteran emergency preparedness officials have been overwhelmed.
If we have a repeat of a 1918-like experience, I can't imagine anything that would be closer to a living hell than that experience of 12 to 24 months of pandemic influenza.
Prime time. Once again, Brian Ross.
His Excellency, Mr. George W. Bush, President of the United States of America.
Mr. Secretary General.
On the same stage where he has warned the world of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, President Bush this week warned the world must prepare for a new weapon of mass destruction, a global epidemic of killer flu.
If left unchallenged, this virus could become the first pandemic of the 21st century.
Are we prepared in this country today?
We're not even close to being prepared in this country. I mean, the short answer to the question, are we prepared, is absolutely not.
If that flu were to hit this country this winter, how bad?
If we had a significant worldwide epidemic of this particular avian flu, the H5N1 virus, I think we would see outcomes that would be virtually impossible to imagine, even to a world that has just witnessed some of the most horrible scenes of a natural disaster that any of us will ever see in our lifetimes.
Carla, it's your mother.
For the victims, they at first wouldn't know if it's the kind of routine flu that comes every year or the killer flu called H5N1.
The world doesn't stop for the flu, but you do.
If it's the killer flu, the world will stop too.
We do all we could to quarantine. We do all we could. It's not a happy thought. It's something that keeps the President of the United States awake. It keeps me awake.
The man in charge of making sure this country is prepared for a killer flu epidemic is Secretary of Health and Human Services Michael Levitt, who took office just this January. The plan calls for him to run operations out of this crisis center in Washington.
This is a very serious version of a disease that can literally take lives by the millions.
Is this country prepared today for this epidemic?
Not as prepared as we need to be. We're better prepared today than we were yesterday. We'll be better prepared tomorrow than we are today. But no one in the world is prepared enough yet.
So the answer is no, we are not prepared.
Not as prepared as we need to be.
The draft report of the federal government's own emergency plan, examined by Prime Time, predicts as many as 200,000 Americans will die within a few months, considered a conservative estimate.
Well, the first thing is everybody in America is going to say, where's a vaccine? And they're going to find out that it's really darn hard to make vaccine. It takes a really long time, and they may queue up and demand, but it's not there for them.
In fact, the draft report says it won't be until 6 months after the first outbreak that any vaccine will be available, and then only in limited supply.
And even that's optimistic.
So if we're hit by this epidemic, there's not going to be vaccine for everybody.
No.
But while there's no vaccine to stop the flu, there is one medicine to treat it, and only one. Made at this plant in Switzerland by the Roche pharmaceutical company. It's called Tamiflu.
If you feel fluish, see your doctor early.
Roche has been selling Tamiflu for years. But it was only recently that scientists realized it is the one medicine so far proven effective against the killer flu, H5N1. And that has created a huge demand and a critical shortage. The whole world wants what's coming out of that one plant in Switzerland.
Exactly.
Can they supply the whole world?
No. All of the wealthiest countries in the world are trying to purchase stockpiles of Tamiflu. Our current stockpile is around 2.5 million courses of treatment.
And the government knows that at least, or predicts, 200 million people would be infected?
It looks like we have a shortage.
How many doses do we have of Tamiflu?
Our objective is to have 20 million doses of Tamiflu, or enough for 20 million people.
Today?
No, we don't have that today, but most
How much do we have today?
Currently, we have about 6 million that have been both ordered and will be delivered this year.
On hand today?
No, we have 2 million that are on hand today.
And how is it that we don't have more?
Well, first of all, no one does.
But officials in Australia say they do have more. And in Great Britain, officials say they will soon have enough for 1/4 of the population.
I think at the moment, with 2.5 million doses, you're pretty vulnerable.
European health officials at a conference this week in Malta said they were astonished at the U.S. lack of planning. Professor John Oxford of the Royal London Hospital.
The lack of advanced planning up to the moment in the United States, in the sense of not having a huge stockpile, which I think your citizens deserve, has surprised me, and I've been rather dismayed about it.
Faced with worldwide demand, the Roche company, which makes Tamiflu, has set up a first-come, first-served waiting list, with the United States nowhere near the top.
Do we wish we had ordered it sooner and more of it? I suspect one could say yes. Are we moving rapidly to assure that we have it? The answer to that is also yes.
Why didn't the U.S. order it sooner?
I can't answer that. I don't know the answer.
It once again, just 2 weeks after Hurricane Katrina, raises questions about the Bush administration and its ability to plan for a predictable natural disaster.
We can't just wing it. When we wing it, we get New Orleans.
Even the president's closest ally on Capitol Hill, the Republican leader of the Senate, Bill Frist, is now sounding the alarm about the country's lack of Tamiflu.
We are way underprepared. What if it does break out? And it could be tomorrow here in the United States. So the Tamiflu is what people would go after. It's what you're going to ask for, I'm going to ask for immediately.
Tamiflu is already in short supply for the public, and officials of the Roche company say there could well be a run on the medicine before this winter's flu season. How will it work? Who will get the life-saving drug? Who won't?
As far as I know, there is no coherent plan for who will get the meager supplies.
With 300 million people, how do you decide who gets the 2.5 million doses?
Well, that's part of our planning process.
Won't everyone want Tamiflu for themselves, for their families, if this hits? And you're going to have to say, we don't have enough.
Well, that's not something I want to say, and that's the reason we're moving so rapidly.
But you're going to have to, aren't you?
Well, it isn't going to happen tomorrow, but if it happened the day after that, we would not be in as good a position as we will be in 6 months.
So, for at least this coming winter, this country will be in much the same situation as it was in 1918.
We didn't have Tamiflu then, and we didn't have the vaccine then, and we struggled to try to save people through the medical care that we had, which was pretty good, and we had a pretty sophisticated public health system. But the fact is, a lot of people died then. And
this time?
A lot of people will die.
Up next, surviving in an earthquake zone. There's a 60% chance of the big one happening. So how can you improve your chances of getting out from it alive when prime time returns? Prime time. And now, from San Francisco, California, John Quinones.
Nowhere do the shockwaves from New Orleans echo more loudly than the San Francisco Bay Area. In this region, the next big one isn't a matter of where, but when, and with no warning. Now keep in mind, some of what you're about to see are dramatizations. What could happen?
A bright morning in this gleaming city by the bay. It starts with a tremor, and then the violent shaking begins for more than a minute. It feels like an eternity.
Bridges down, Bay Bridge, Golden Gate Bridge, all of those.
We're likely to have a lot of fires. The ports of the Bay Area may liquefy and fail.
Landlines, cell phone towers will be completely out, and massive building damage.
Another major earthquake right in the core of the Bay Area will be a disaster on the same scale as Katrina, perhaps larger.
In a massive quake, there's no time to evacuate. An estimated 10,000 people could die. Gas lines would erupt and fires would break out, but there'd be no way to fight them because water lines would also ruptured. It's happened before.
The 1989 World Series,
October 1989, the World Series is just getting underway.
I'm Al Michaels.
Sportscaster Al Michaels is in mid-sentence when the earth begins to rumble.
And he fails to get Dave Parker at second base, so the Oakland A's take
I'll tell you what, we're having an earthquake.
A 7-magnitude tremor has hit 60 miles south of the city.
This is a section of the freeway in the East Bay near Oakland.
4,000 injured, 63 dead. Part of a freeway collapses. $6 billion in property damage.
Prepare yourselves! Shut off the gas! Shut off electricity!
All around the city, fires erupted from buildings now tossed together like matchsticks. They were built on unstable landfill that shifts during an earthquake.
What happened behind you?
Unfortunately, this building across the street here collapsed due to the shaking and then caught on fire. So that's a brand new structure there.
Seismologist Mary Lou Zobak says many of the same problems exist today.
Most of the building stock in San Francisco, particularly the residential housing, was built prior to the 1960s, something like 75% of it.
Not up to?
Not up to modern standards and likely to be severely damaged or destroyed.
Scary, scary thought.
Very scary.
Scary because the experts say, of all places, San Francisco should have learned from its past, should have strengthened its buildings and highways, should have had better plans in place more quickly.
I'm not thinking just outside the blocks. We're blowing up the box here in San Francisco.
Mayor Gavin Newsom says Hurricane Katrina galvanized the way he thinks about future disasters in his own city, though he admits he isn't fully prepared.
You said it yourself last week, we are not where we need to be.
No, and we'll never be.
After so many years of dire predictions, why aren't you?
Well, I'll tell you, the last 4 or 5 years, we frankly, a lot of us got an eye off the ball and focused almost exclusively on man-made disasters and homeland security. We've got a lot of work to do in this country on that, but we also got to get back to the basics. And that means looking at Mother Nature, be it tornadoes and hurricanes, obviously to the issues of earthquakes. We have not had the big one here in San Francisco.
Alarmingly, many of the warnings after 1989 have not been heeded.
You haven't retrofitted the highways, the Bay Bridge, schools,
no, it's a hospitals.
Hospitals. I asked you what's lacking in earthquake preparedness, and you said everything.
Everything needs to be reviewed. You know, if I have to do a mass evacuation of 1.5, 2 million people, depending on the time of the day, and if I don't have a Bay Bridge and a Golden Gate Bridge, we're in essence an island here.
Like the Bay Area, much of the rest of the country is now waking up to the threat of natural disasters. Beyond California, the landscape is laced with earthquake faults in Utah, South Carolina, and the new Madrid fault near Memphis and St. Louis. And if you thought the levees in New Orleans were an isolated problem, just outside San Francisco, there's an entire network of levees where a quake could wreak havoc.
I'm walking on a levee right on top of a fault line, just a few miles from the San Francisco Bay. In the event of a major earthquake, many of these levees, already in serious disrepair, would break, flooding vast areas of that delta. And worse yet, salt water from the bay would then contaminate vital fresh water, the drinking water for some 20 million Californians, all the way down to Los Angeles and San Diego. It could be a crippling catastrophe.
Just last year, one levee broke and 12,000 acres flooded. An earthquake could cause Katrina-level flooding. And as we've learned these past weeks, most states and even the federal government are just not prepared for that.
The state of California does not have one person in the Office of Emergency Services who is a full-time earthquake person.
Susan Tubersing is the director of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute.
The staff in the National FEMA organization that deals with earthquakes is just a fraction of the size it used to be. There used to be 30 or 40 people in that part of FEMA, and today I think maybe there's 5 or 6. And that's for the whole country. If we're vulnerable to an earthquake, our security is vulnerable. You can't tell me that after Hurricane Katrina, we're not more vulnerable than we were a few weeks ago.
And yet, a third of all Californians say they're not prepared for an earthquake.
The one thing we're trying to communicate in San Francisco is a sad reality, and I don't think I should be the one saying it because I don't feel comfortable saying it, but you're on your own. You know, the federal government's not going to come in and save the day within 24 minutes, let alone 24 hours. If we have an 8.2, 8.3 earthquake in San Francisco, people are going to need to be prepared for a minimum of 72 hours on their own.
We'll tell you how to prepare for those 72 hours later in the broadcast. But during a quake, if you're caught inside, experts say stand against an interior wall, away from windows and breaking glass. If you can, get under a heavy desk or table. If you're outside, get away from anything that might fall, like trees, buildings, or electrical wires. And if you're in your car, drive to an open place away from overpasses and underpasses until the shaking stops. We'll be right back.
Up next, what if terrorists set off a nuclear bomb in your city? Most of your first instincts to save yourself are wrong. We'll tell you what's right. Next. Prime time. Once again, Chris Cuomo.
This Emergency Operations Center is in standby mode right now. You can see the places set aside for the FBI, the police, but in a real emergency it would be jam-packed, fully staffed, and running in just an hour. And your life might very well depend on the decisions made right here. So, here's our next scenario. This room is abuzz with word of a nuclear bomb snuck in by terrorists. If it were to explode in your city, you probably think you'd be dead, right? Well, you're wrong. From top experts, we've discovered you can survive if you know just what to do, and you do it. Here's the key: the first 15 minutes. There would be no warning. 1 minute, a busy day in Times Square. The next, a potential worst-case scenario. A 10-kiloton terrorist nuclear device constructed with stolen Russian uranium detonates on one of the busiest intersections in America. In a half-mile radius around the blast, everything would simply cease to exist. This is the event contemplated in an unpublished Homeland Security document reported by the National Journal. The report describes an attack in Washington, D.C. In New York, according to the report's formulas, the damage would be even more devastating. This animation is based on restricted software used by the government and obtained by Primetime. It shows the effects of a 10-kiloton device on Times Square.
90% of the people in this first circle are killed.
Jerry Hauer has spent years thinking of scenarios just like this. He was the director of New York's Office of Emergency Management and is now an ABC consultant.
Several 100,000 people would be killed either by burns, by debris, by the blast, or by exposure to radiation. The good news is if you look up and you see it, you've got a chance. You're not part of that initial blast.
And according to experts, chances of surviving the initial fallout increase because Midtown's massive skyscrapers of steel and concrete should absorb and contain the blast. My mind takes me back again, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, where everything was leveled. Not the case in New York?
No, a lot of those were wood frame structures. New York City, most of our buildings are either steel or concrete, reinforced by steel.
So in the next 10-block ring, far fewer consequences. And then outside that second ring, a city eerily intact. We are now at detonation plus 15 seconds, the aftermath chillingly similar to 9/11. A massive cloud rising up 5 miles into the air above the city, except this one contains deadly radioactive dust. Within 15 minutes, that deadly plume will start falling back to Earth and begin drifting with the wind. So now everything depends on time.
10, 15 minutes later, you're going to then be exposed to a phenomenal amount of lethal radiation.
The clock is ticking. For more than 7 million people, continued survival will depend on what they do next. Problem is, your first instincts may be wrong. Most people, first thing they'll do is turn on the television to find out what's going on. Is that going to work?
TV might not be on in the immediate time after a blast.
The TV doesn't work, so now you pick up the phone.
Electrical grids could be out, and it could knock out the phone grids.
So I get in my car, if I have one, and I take off. Right move?
Well, there's no question there's going to be gridlock, and car's not going to provide any shielding in one of these events. But
while you may not know what to do, the government has been running drills like these to help save citizens. Here's their plan. Within minutes of a nuclear detonation, a sophisticated computer program will track the path of that nuclear plume. First responders will use available communication to inform you where the danger is, and then evacuate people out of the path of the fallout.
Time is of the essence. You can't be fooling around with time here. You have to be able to give care to the patients immediately, or as close to immediately as possible.
Ken Rasky is president of the Greater New York Hospital Association.
9/11 burned it into our brains of what level of protection we actually need.
One lesson learned, the need for beefed up communications. So even if ordinary channels fail, help can still be on the way. Rasky says they've drilled to prepare for treating the injured. Most common, decontamination. Radiation destroys the body's ability to create white and red blood cells. So hospitals have set up over 100 facilities like this one.
We have the ability probably to decontaminate at least 60 people an hour. If it was a major event, we could probably go faster.
Of course, this assumes that rescue workers would stick around after a blast. Business Week magazine reports that just 57% of healthcare workers say they would come to work during a radiological event.
I think that that's really selling our caregivers short. I have the greatest confidence level that the doctors and the nurses and the technicians will be bedside or gurney side.
At least here in New York, your feeling is the people don't quit.
No, they got a New York attitude, which means we're going to be in there slugging it away.
But despite that optimism, Howard doubts that even a city like New York could absorb the impact of a major nuclear catastrophe.
When you're talking about 100,000 that need decontamination or 200,000 that need decontamination or medical care, I just don't see any city being prepared to deal with that.
And so far, the government doesn't seem to have educated citizens about what they can do to protect themselves if a bomb goes off in the city.
I think in the event of a nuclear attack, I think there's very little we can do.
A nuclear attack is not something that I've ever considered.
No, my family doesn't have a nuclear plant at all. Matter of fact, I don't think most people do.
That said, across the board, experts believe even if the government comes up short, you can still survive if you prepare. And here are some key tips. See the plume? Officials should be able to tell you which direction is safe. and that is the direction you should go. The plume can be radioactive for up to 2 weeks, so your best bet may be to stay in a protected place, like a basement or interior room that has emergency provisions and can be sealed against radioactive dust.
When you're sheltering it in place, duct tape and plastic can protect you from the particles.
And even if you do come in contact with the radioactive plume, there are steps you can take to decontaminate yourself with just soap and water.
The first thing is to remove the radioactive materials as quickly as possible. So you shed your clothing, you get decontaminated, you get washed off, you get a shower.
The key is to focus on how to survive, because like the rest of life, attitude can make the difference, even in the worst of situations. Is it a waste of time for people to prepare for a situation like this?
I think it's absolutely essential that people are prepared.
Why, if the chance of your making it through is not so great?
Because the chance is actually pretty good if you know what to do. And the better prepared they are, the more likely that they are to survive.
Up next, a 5-minute survival kit. The experts tell you exactly what you need to do and when you need to do it, with you being the key word.
The fact is that you are your own first responder, for yourself, for your family, for your neighbors, for your community.
When prime time returns.
We started tonight by saying this isn't just an hour about what can go wrong, it's about what you can do right. Now the literal nuts and bolts to make sure that happens. What the experts say every person needs to have and every person needs to do if you want to get out alive. Here's Cynthia McFadden.
When disaster strikes, people caught in the chaos are rarely at their best.
People desperately waving flags for help.
They're scared, confused, and desperate for clear direction.
Absolute desperation here.
When your heart rate gets above, 130 or 140, you turn into an idiot. We can't think rationally. We do all these crazy, crazy things. And the thought of an entire population in that state is truly and utterly terrifying.
What are the risks out there where you are? What do I have to be prepared to do? And how am I going to help myself until other resources get to me? The main thing to me is a family plan. The family plan means that you and your loved ones sit down sometime, hopefully maybe even this weekend, you'll sit down, you'll say, okay, we could have a disaster here. What would we do? Who would pick up the kids after school if I can't get to them?
We recommend you evacuate the island.
A family emergency plan needs to be researched, discussed, and implemented. So, step 1. What are the risks in your local area? And what would you do if any of those disasters happen? Would you stay at home, or would you have to go? The family must agree on a location to meet up if separated. You must agree on where you would travel to if evacuation was necessary. You must know the escape routes. And you must establish an out-of-state contact and phone numbers, a relative maybe that each family member could reach to keep in contact with each other. Local numbers often don't work in a disaster zone. This is critical.
There's nothing more terrifying than the separation and lack of communication with the people that you care about. This can undermine everything. It can undermine your willingness to listen to an official order to evacuate. We got to get this sort of somehow into the American psyche. What would we do if there was an emergency, and what should we stockpile in the house and put in the car? Just do that.
Emergency managers we talked to this week all agreed on the need to stockpile food and water. But for how long?
Most people tell you that you should have enough in the way of food and medication for 7 to 10 days.
The recommendation, 1 gallon of water per person per day. And food that won't spoil, canned food, don't forget the can opener, and boxes of energy bars and dried fruit are a good start. Keep some in the house and some in the car.
People are overrating their disaster preparedness levels. They think that because they have a battery-operated flashlight somewhere in the house, they don't really know where it is, they have food in the pantry, and they've stored water from Y2K, that they're ready for any disaster. Well, put them into a backpack, put it by the front door in that front closet, and so you can grab it. It's all in one kit, one place. You just grab it and go.
It's all common sense, really. If you have to run out the door in a dire emergency, what you take with you can save your life. First aid kits, cash and coins, a battery-powered radio and flashlight, plastic sheeting and duct tape to seal up a room for a crude shelter. You need copies of important documents, insurance policies, tax returns, birth certificates, property deeds, all critical to recreating your life if necessary. Enough prescription medicine to last a few weeks. Extra clothes. The needs can vary depending on the area of the country and the type of disaster you face.
The fact is that you are your own first responder, for yourself, for your family, for your neighbors, for your community.
Experts say that at least in the case of most natural disasters, your chances of dying are rather small.
So the good news is you're going to live, so that's great. The bad news is your level of comfort and that of the people you love, and men, I'm talking to you, you're not John Wayne. You can't just tough it out. You have to be prepared wherever you are, because you don't know when disasters will actually strike.
Everyone at 11 o'clock.
We begin with the president.